Hello and welcome to this edition of Capgemini Invent Talks. Today we're going to be talking about the energy transition and our road to a net zero society. I'm joined by Igor and Kim, both experts in this field. Kim, I'm hearing a lot about Scope 3 emissions, but what is it exactly?
Yeah, so you're correct. Many companies are currently reporting on their emissions. And what we see is that they usually report on Scope 1 and 2 emissions. So Scope 1 are the emissions that come from under their direct ownership or control within their operations. And when we talk about Scope 2 emissions, we talk about the emissions that come from electricity or heating from buildings, for example, that they purchase from third parties. And then when you talk about Scope 3 emissions, those are the indirect emissions that come from a company's value chain. But what we currently see is that most companies leave those out in their monitoring.
Now we know what Scope 3 is, but why is it important?
Yeah, so as Kim explained on Scope 1, 2 and 3, Scope 3 is so important because it makes up for, on average, 75% of organizations' greenhouse gas emissions. And even though 75 is such a big amount of the greenhouse gas emissions, only about 25% of the companies are currently monitoring or reporting on those greenhouse gas emissions. And on top of that, those companies, quite a lot of the companies, are not taking this into account or actually ignoring Scope 3 in their approach to reach carbon neutrality.
25%, that's not a lot. Why aren't companies including this in their net zero strategy?
Yeah, so most companies are struggling at the moment because it really requires collaboration across the whole value chain. And they're really struggling to kickstart these efforts. And that is why I think that's very important to have the involvement of the government here. Luckily, we do see some trends that show that more governmental institutions across the whole world are actually establishing these legislations. So for example, if you look at the Kyoto Protocol, but also the Paris Agreement, it requires countries to report to the UN on their emissions, but also their climate policies and their progress towards the targets of net zero.
All right, and apart from legislation, what else can we do?
Yeah, so a lot needs to be done to really get a clear picture of all the emissions, including the Scope 3 emissions. So first of all, in order to get a clear picture of it, organizations need to be able to monitor it properly. And for that, they need the right tools, technologies, and measures. To get a clear picture of the Scope 3 emissions, you need a really large depth and breadth in data, so in the data quality. Currently, that data quality is not great, which makes it very difficult for organizations to set clear targets. Even more so, like Kim said, on the regulation, because at this point, we don't have a clear alignment on the measures on a global or regional level for that matter. And finally, to get a clear picture of all the emissions, including the Scope 3 emissions, companies need to work together with their partners and the other organizations in the value chain. The way we get that collaboration in that value chain to get a clear picture of Scope 3 at this point is often lacking. But finally, we need to remember that getting a clear picture of the emissions and the Scope 3 emissions is not the goal in itself. Of course, the goal is to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions, and Scope 3 is a way to get the picture of where the emissions are and how we can potentially reduce those emissions.
Thank you. Would you like to make an impact in your net zero strategy? I would like to refer you to the World Energy Market Observatory report by Capgemini. Thank you for watching this edition of Capgemini Invent Talks. See you next time.